Welcome back, everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York, and we're continuing our broadcasts heavily focused on this coronavirus, the CCP virus. First off, we're going to be going into the Chinese regime's new push of what they're referring to as wolf warrior diplomacy. And we're going to be also going into some of the different types of censorship and some of the heavy-handed tactics being taken in some areas to fight this virus. And of course, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell if you're on YouTube. Again, folks, we need your support. So the Chinese regime is launching a new policy, what they're calling wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, the term wolf warrior comes from a title of a Chinese action film. And before it was kind of seen as something more cringeworthy. It's like saying keyboard warrior in some circles. But the regime itself now is pushing for this. And what it refers to is a very strong form of diplomacy, very aggressive diplomacy. Now, under this new form of wolf warrior diplomacy, Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, has called on all foreign envoys, all these foreign diplomats of the Chinese regime, to open the battlefield everywhere. And of course, we can see this taking place in the, say, more vocal and more aggressive approach the Chinese regime is taking with its diplomats. For example, calling out Trump directly on just about every statement he makes about China, threatening Australia, calling out different measures taken in the UK, pressuring Germany, you name it. We'll be going into this. But of course, one of the elements of this is that when you push things to an extreme, sometimes you get the opposite result. And it appears that this is what's happening with the Chinese regime's wolf warrior diplomacy policy already. So as a recent example of this, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang confronted journalists for 20 minutes. And he was asking them whether they published everything he had said. This is in reference to some of the back and forth they've had in Australia, where the local government there is calling for investigations into the Chinese regime and also calling on WHO members to all get together and join in investigations into the Chinese regime and its handling of this virus. The CCP struck back. They threatened to not send, say, for example, students to Australia. They threatened Australia financially. And so now this Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman is confronting Australian journalists on whether or not they have published his statements, allegedly in full, it seems. And of course, this brings up the question of independence for these media outlets. Geng Shuang it seems to be expecting these journalists to basically be acting as his mouthpiece. Carnegie Europe had a great analysis on this. They call it the cost of Europe bowing to China's disinformation and pressure. Now, Carnegie Europe is saying that the Chinese regime's policies of doing this is already showing its true face to the world. Overcoming the coronavirus pandemic is also about the EU defending its own principles of transparency and truthfulness, both of which China is aggressively challenging. And so what do we see playing out right now? Areas where the Chinese regime has made inroads over the years, they are testing these inroads to see whether they bow down to pressure from the regime. Carnegie Europe notes the CCP has launched a, quote, massive campaign of disinformation and intimidation. It is noting that the CCP is targeting Western embassies in China, any government that calls for independent inquiry into the origins of this virus, and any organization that challenges the regime's narratives on the virus. It notes that after the Australian Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, called for an investigation, the Chinese regime threatened to retaliate by banning imports from Australia. It notes how the CCP allegedly lobbied the European Union to edit their disinformation report. They did this study on disinformation, of course, talked about Russian disinformation and Chinese disinformation. New York Times and Politico had reported that the Chinese regime lobbied the people writing this and pressured them to take a lighter hand on China. It also notes that the impact for China has been the opposite of its intentions. But this wolf warrior diplomacy is making it so that all these countries that have been dealing with China over the years are seeing that the Chinese regime is hostile. The Sydney Morning Herald published an opinion piece noting the Chinese regime's threats against Australia. And it reported, quote, Ambassador Cheng Jing-ye has done Australia a great service. He has taken off the mask. China's ambassador has shown us the true face of the Chinese government's feelings for Australia. The Chinese Communist Party for years has been working systematically to undermine Australia's sovereignty, to, quote, take over our political system. But the Chinese regime has always kept the smiling mask of friendship in place. So again, we're seeing this shift in Europe. We're seeing this shift in Australia. Moving on now to the U.S., Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said on April 29th,
look, we still haven't gained access, the world hasn't gained access to the WIV, the Virology Institute there. We don't know precisely where this virus originated from. There are multiple labs that are continuing to conduct work, we think, on contagious pathogens inside of China today, and we don't know if they are operating at a level of security to prevent this from happening again. Remember, this isn't the first time that we've had a virus come out of China.
Now, the United States, question it if you'd like, does play the role of kind of spearheading a lot of what happens globally. It is still, even though China's trying to challenge it on this, regarded as the world leader. And so Mike Pompeo has, of course, been under a lot of pressure from the Chinese regime. They've been saying things back to him, and he's not backing down. And notably, neither is Trump. Like him or not, this is in fact what's happening. And of course, other countries, it's hard to say maybe they would take the same, strong stance. But other countries are getting behind this. They are not folding to pressure from the Chinese regime. And of course, the Australian Prime Minister did have a phone call with President Trump about calling for investigations into this Wuhan virology lab to see whether it was the origin of this virus. Now, Trump has also continued on this. He said that the United States will take action against the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And he's not just calling out the CCP, he's also calling out the WHO. So Trump said, quote, we're doing very serious investigations. We are not happy with that whole situation because we believe it could have been stopped at the source. It could have been stopped quickly, and it wouldn't have spread all over the world. Now, U.S. intelligence agencies are allegedly investigating whether the CCP downplayed or hid the virus. Trump has talked about these investigations. And they're also investigating the World Health Organization, the WHO. Of course, Trump put a freeze on U.S. funding to the WHO while this investigation plays out. And Trump said, quote, we knew things that they didn't know. Either they didn't know or they didn't tell us. Right now, they're literally a pipe organ for China. He's referring to the WHO. And he continues, quote, that's the way I view it. So we're seeing and we're looking and we're watching. Again, referring to monitoring the actions of the WHO during this time. The Washington Times is reporting that they have received an alleged U.S. government analysis which says the Wuhan Institute of Virology is the, quote, most likely source of this new coronavirus. Now here's what it says. The document, compiled from open sources and not a finished product, says there is no smoking gun to blame the virus on either the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan branch of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, both located in the city where the first outbreaks were reported. There is circumstantial evidence to suggest such may be the case. Now, of course, this paper is not public. They have allegedly received a forward copy or a leaked copy, not clear which, of this report. But at the very least, it suggests that this investigation is in fact moving forward. And of course, all of this is happening while the Chinese regime is putting this pressure on the U.S., putting this pressure on Australia. As I mentioned in the previous recent episode, for the Chinese regime, this is a life or death issue. All this pressure on the Chinese regime, making it look bad, is unraveling decades of soft power, decades of them launching campaigns such as the three warfares: psychological warfare, media warfare, legal warfare, which I've talked about before, basically to manage global perceptions of the Chinese regime. All of that is being undone within the span of a few months. In addition to this, it's destroying the soft power. As they're mentioning in Australia, the mask, that friendly mask the CCP once put on when doing business deals has fallen off. as they mentioned in this European report, they now see the Chinese regime is hostile to them. And they see that all these favors, all this kind talk, all the business deals the Chinese regime has offered them comes with a cost. And right now the Chinese regime is going around and trying to cash in on that cost. It's trying to pressure them and say, if you don't, go along with us, if you don't censor this, if you move forward and call for investigations, we will hit you financially. Of course, I've talked about foreign influence of the Chinese regime in a lot of different countries. How, for example, through the United Front, they will bribe, buy off, influence different political circles. In Canada, for example, they had the Sidewinder report several years back now talking about this. In the United States, it's not much of a discussion. I'd say it's just about to hit the surface. But in Australia, this is very much part of the national discussion. And of course, within that environment, some of the politicians who argue, okay, yes, they have sided with China, they say it's because the business ties with China are so intertwined, again, that they can't afford to be too harsh with them. And the Chinese regime knows this. They're being hit on multiple fronts. On the economic side, businesses are pulling out of China. Its own factories are shut down. It dealt with this U.S.-China trade war. Trump is hitting their high-tech industry. He's hitting them on multiple angles. Japan is paying companies to leave China. And the U.S. and other countries are also talking about doing similar things. India, for example, is banning Chinese foreign investment. The EU is actually talking about this as well, as is the UK, talking about how the regime is trying to weaponize foreign investment during this time when the global economy is, unstable. And so everyone sees it for what it is. Its operations are being impacted. Its businesses are being impacted. Its soft power operations are being impacted. And now investigations are being launched into it. And if those investigations succeed, what's going to happen next? It is going to provide evidence for international lawsuits against the CCP. And so for the Chinese regime, this is a life or death thing. It's ironic they call it wolf warrior diplomacy because right now it really is like a cornered wolf. Now, moving on, the big discussions right now are about censorship and about heavy-handed methods being taken by local governments. YouTube, of course, deleted a video of 2 California doctors who were making a case for lifting restrictions during the coronavirus outbreak, and YouTube is now being called out for censoring that video. They removed it. The head of YouTube came out just recently and said that they will be following WHO guidelines. If a video goes against WHO recommendations, they will remove it from the internet. They will remove it from YouTube. And we just saw this happen with this video of these 2 doctors in California who are making a case based on their analysis on why these different restrictions, say pseudo lockdowns we're in, should be lifted. Senator Ted Cruz shot back at them and he wrote on Twitter, quote, YouTube and Google should not have the power to censor speech, particularly on critical issues of concern. The doctor's views here aren't fraud. If YouTube disagrees, argue on the merits. Don't abuse monopoly power and special congressional liability immunity to become speech police. That's what YouTube is doing. Facebook has begun doing as well, as have other social media platforms. Facebook has announced a new policy, for example, where they're going to be more aggressively cracking down on what they view as misinformation about this virus. That they will be redirecting people who see disinformation or misinformation as they define it to the WHO. And of course, again, the WHO is being investigated right now, and of course has had its funding frozen by the U.S. for allegedly acting as basically a sock puppet of the Chinese regime, because it has not been acting independently. It's been repeating what the Chinese regime has been saying. And so again, as I've mentioned, who fact-checks the fact-checkers? If the fact-checker itself, if the organization being relied on to give us information is being viewed right now as unreliable, how can we use them as the standard across all platforms that is used to say what you can or cannot say? This is, of course, one of the big debates happening in the U.S. right now. In addition to this, on the political level, this is interesting. Andrew Yang, you might remember the Democrat candidate, is suing New York over the Democratic primary cancellation. Former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang is suing the New York State Board of Elections after it voted to remove Senator Bernie Sanders from the primary ballot, effectively canceling the state's presidential voting contest. And so this ties into again, how this all relates. We're seeing censorship of speech, and we're now seeing this virus being used as well for political influence. And moving on, we're also seeing this go into the realm of religion, religious freedom. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio is under fire for breaking up a rabbi's funeral that was being attended by hundreds of people. This rabbi had died of the virus. Mayor Bill de Blasio lashed out at Hasidic residents of the Williamsburg section in Brooklyn late Tuesday night after personally overseeing the dispersal of a crowd of hundreds of mourners who had gathered for the funeral of a rabbi who died of the coronavirus. Bill de Blasio wrote on Twitter, quote, "Something absolutely unacceptable happened in Williamsburg tonight, a large funeral gathering in the middle of this pandemic. When I heard, I went there myself to ensure the crowd was dispersed, and what I saw will not be tolerated so long as we are fighting the coronavirus." Of course, there was a lot of criticism, actually, it seems even on both sides of the aisle, because this is being seen not just as religious discrimination, but of course as anti-Semitism. Now, Donald Trump Jr. came out and he responded, noting two separate Twitter posts from Bill de Blasio that suggest he's having double standards when it comes to religions. One of them, Bill de Blasio had tweeted to the Muslims, he said, quote, "To the Muslim New Yorkers beginning their celebrations tonight who need halal meals, we have them across our 400-plus grab-and-go meal sites and are bringing hundreds of thousands more to the 32 sites most frequented by our Muslim communities." And then Bill de Blasio tweeted, quote, "My message to the Jewish community and all communities is this simple. The time for warnings has passed. I have instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. This is about stopping the disease and saving lives, period." And of course, this is part of a larger debate, one on whether there are double standards being used for different religions. Of course, mosques in some areas are being allowed to stay open where Christian churches are not. Now, this brings up a few different issues. One of the big ones, of course, is this debate over whether the U.S. Constitution and its protections of freedom of religion can be suspended during an incident like this. Now, it's unsure on whether these things are going to be able to fly. Now, Attorney General William Barr, for example, has said that the Justice Department will get behind Americans who file lawsuits against governors if the governors take measures that are, say, overly heavy-handed. When it comes to this issue of religious freedom, of course, this is one of the big questions. And when it comes to these double standards, this is going to be, I don't want to use the word interesting, but something to keep an eye on. Because yes, while the New York State does appear to be allowing Muslims to gather still, and not allowing other religious groups to gather, how this will be perceived later will be based on the question of, well, what were these measures of quarantine or semi-quarantine necessary? Were these measures of social distancing effective? Because if he allowed Muslims to gather, and it turns out that a lot of them get sick and get the virus and maybe die from it, of course it will be seen as him, basically allowing these people to get the virus and be harmed by it, while upholding these restrictions on other religious groups. In other words, if it plays out in that way, it will be seen as an action that harmed Muslims rather than helped them. In other words, did not protect them, while protecting, say, the Jews and the Christians. If it turns out the other way, that these social distancing laws, these different regulations are in fact not effective in stopping things, then yes, it will be seen as him having double standards where he is protecting one religious group, in this case Muslims, while allowing restrictions and very harsh restrictions against Jews and Christians. It's one of those issues that we'll have to see, again, how it unfolds. Now, with that said, I wanted to jump again to some of our classical literature. And, actually, this made me think of a quote from Frederick Bastiat's The Law, where he discusses the nature of, say, heavy-handed government and socialism, notably. And so he says, quote, "Here I am taking on the most popular prejudice of our time. It is not considered enough that law should be just. It must be philanthropic. It is not sufficient that it should guarantee to every citizen the free and inoffensive exercise of his faculties, applied to his physical, intellectual, and moral development. It is required to extend well-being, instruction, and morality directly over the nation. This is the fascinating side of socialism. But I repeat it. These two missions of the law contradict each other. We have to choose between them. A citizen cannot at the same time be free and not free. The socialists say since the law organizes justice, why should it not organize labor, instruction, and religion? Why? Because it could not organize labor, instruction, and religion without disorganizing justice. Now, the funny thing about Frederick Bastiat is in his day he was considered a classical liberal. Well, he was a classical liberal. These days he'd probably be considered more of a libertarian. But of course, let me know what you all think of that. Leave your thoughts below in the comments. And again, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Again, folks, we really need your support. And also click that notification bell if you're on YouTube. We get alerts when new videos are up. We'll be continuing these broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, so please tune in. Again, that said, folks, please take care of yourselves. Stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you next time.